There was a time not that long ago that people used to look into the landscape for answers. Now they would look into the forests, into the rivers for spirits and mysterious beings that could help explain some of the things that were happening. And out here in the marshlands of Lincolnshire, there was one particular spirit that was both loved and feared, and the locals gave him the name the Tiddy Mun.
Long, long ago, before landscapes like this were drained away under the guise of agricultural improvement, before dikes cut through the marsh and winter floods were tamed in the name of progress and profit, there existed a belief system that our modern minds might barely recognise today. For in those days, when dark and misty twilight settled across the wetlands, people believed the world around them was alive with unseen forces. As the moon cast its pale light across the black water and the wind whispered through the swaying reeds, the fenlands became a place of strange and uneasy wonder. The marsh breathed and shifted with tide and weather, mist drifted across the waterholes like wandering spirits, and the lonely cries of birds echoed through the night air. It was said that this place did not belong entirely to the living. The people who lived around the marshlands spoke quietly of the things that moved through the swamp after dark, of boggarts lurking in the reeds, and of will-o'-the-wikes appearing above the ground, dancing and flickering in a way that might lead the curious straight into the dark waters below. And when the mist lay thick upon the fen, some swore they heard voices drifting across the marsh, whispers carried on the wind that did not belong to any living soul. There were darker stories still, of shapes moving slowly through the fog where no person stood, and of pale hands rising silently from the black waters, hands with no arms to follow them, reaching blindly through the reeds before slipping once more beneath the surface. In a place like this, it was said a sensible person did not wander the marsh after dark, not without a charm tucked safely in their pocket, because the fenlands were believed to be home to an orchestra of strangeness. And among all the strange things said to haunt these marshes, there was one presence whose story still whispers through the pages of old folklore. They called him the Tiddy Mun.
Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire. This is the Wanderlust Way. This is a sort of channel where we are collecting miles and collecting stories at the same time. Now, I first off want to say a massive thank you to everybody that does support the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, becoming members, sending super thanks, because everything that you do is helping the channel to grow, and that's really, really helping me out massively. Now, at this point, I have to say a massive thank you as well to my good friend Tim, who is a local history librarian, and he's helped me with some of the finer details in this story because it is very localised and it's not always readily available on the internet. So we've had to rummage through quite a lot of old books to get some of the details for this. Now, this story comes about from around the 17th century when the landscapes like this were drained. And when they drained, it affected the way people lived. And we've come to a place called Alkborough Flats, which is in North Lincolnshire. Now, this isn't necessarily exactly where our story takes place, but it's the sort of landscape that you can imagine, the marshlands of North Lincolnshire. So the people weren't very happy, yes, but there was one thing that they feared more than anything, and that was how the draining of these landscapes would affect certain spirits and creatures, in particular, the Tiddy Mun. Put on your wellies, everyone. That's enough waffle. Let's wander. Now, before we get too carried away with the spirits lurking in the marshes, let's spare a thought for the people who lived in these places. Because the wetlands, the marshlands, they were not empty. They were teeming with life. And the people that lived here, they had done for generations. They'd learnt to adapt with the rise and fall of the waters. They'd learnt to make a living here. And when the engineers came with their rulers and their maps, they didn't really fully understand what the people here were doing. They said it was pretty much wasteland that was worth turning into agricultural land. But no, they'd learned to live with the landscape.
For the marshland communities of eastern England, the wetlands were not something to be feared or conquered. They were a living landscape that provided for those who understood how to work with it. The dark waters of the fen were rich with fish and eels, caught in traps and baskets set carefully beneath the surface. Wildfowl gathered in great numbers across the flooded pastures, and hunters would stalk the marsh in small boats, bringing back duck and geese to feed their families. The reeds themselves were valuable too. They were cut and dried to thatch the roofs of cottages or used as bedding for livestock. In the boggier ground, people dug peat, drying it in stacks to use as fuel through the long winter months. Cattle grazed the higher patches of marsh during the drier seasons, while ponies and sheep were moved carefully across the landscape as the waters shifted and receded. Life here followed the rhythm of the land. The people knew when the floods would arrive and when the waters would retreat. They knew where the fish gathered in the deeper channels, where birds nested among the reeds, and where the ground beneath the grass could suddenly give way to black, sucking mud. Much of this knowledge was never written down. It was passed from parent to child, learned through years of watching the sky, the water, and the changing seasons. To the fen folk, the marsh was not an enemy. It was their livelihood, their protection, and their home. But like many people whose lives were bound closely to the natural world, they also believed the land itself had powers that demanded respect. The marsh had its moods, its dangers, and according to the old stories, its spirits.
Of all the strange things that the people believed lived amongst the waters, amongst the reeds, from the boggarts and the fairies and the dead hands coming out, there was one spirit, of course, in particular, that was both loved and feared at the same time, because he could be very, very helpful, the Tiddy Mun. But if he was crossed, if he was not respected and he got angry, that's when things could get really, really bad.
According to the old stories passed down through the villages of the Ancombe Valley, the Tiddy Mun lived deep within the still green waterholes of the marsh. He did not often show himself in daylight, though. Instead, he crept out in the twilight hours, when the mists began to gather across the wetlands and the wind whispered softly through the reeds. Those who claimed to glimpse him described a curious little figure, no larger than a small child. He was said to look rather like an old man, though a very tiny one. His hair was long and white, his beard tangled and matted like waterweed, and he wore a grey cloak that blended easily into the drifting marsh mist. When he moved, people said he walked with a slight limp, hobbling slowly through the reeds like an elderly grandfather wandering the fen. But the strangest thing about the Tiddy Mun was the sound he made. He was rarely seen clearly, but he could sometimes be heard. Villagers sitting around their fires on misty evenings spoke of hearing sudden gusts of wind rushing across the marsh, the sound of running water, and then a sharp, laughing cry carried through the darkness. The cry was said to resemble the call of a lapwing, the wild bird sometimes known in these parts as the piewipe. When that eerie sound drifted across the fen, people would glance nervously toward the door and whisper to one another, "Listen, that's Tiddy Mun." And though the sound could make the hair rise slightly on the back of the neck, the old stories say the people were never as frightened of the Tiddy Mun as they were of the other creatures said to haunt the marsh. Boggarts, wandering lights, and the ghostly dead hands of the fens were spoken about with far greater dread. The Tiddy Mun, on the other hand, was thought to be something different, a strange little spirit of the marsh itself, a quiet guardian of the waterholes and the shifting wetlands. And as long as the waters of the fen continued to teem and flow through the boggy landscape, the old people said he would do no harm. In fact, an old rhyme about him was still remembered long after the stories began to fade. It went like this: Tiddy Mun without a name, white head walking lame, while the water teems the fen, Tiddy Mun'll harm none.
Like many of the spirits that were thought to inhabit the natural world, there's often an understanding between the people and the beliefs that they had in the spirits. And in this case, the land we know was very dangerous. It was very treacherous, boggy, marshy underfoot. And sometimes the people that lived here, when the waters rose, they would find that the paths would be lost, like the one behind me. The paths would be covered in water, and they would then look for the help of the Tiddy Mun. And they would perform this sort of ritual and asking for help.
According to the old stories, when the wet seasons came and the waters of the fen began to rise, the marsh could slowly swallow the land around the villages. Floodwater crept across the fields and into the lanes, sometimes reaching right up to the very doors of people's homes. When that happened, the villagers did not always look to engineers or drainage schemes for help. Instead, on the first new moon after the flooding began, families would gather together and walk out toward the edge of the bog. Fathers, mothers and children would stand together in the fading twilight, looking out across the dark expanse of water and reeds. They would join hands, and there, trembling slightly in the evening mist, they would call out across the marsh, "Tiddy Mun without a name, the waters through." The words would drift out over the still water as the last of the daylight faded from the sky, and then the families would listen. Sometimes, or so the old stories claimed, the marsh would answer. From somewhere far out in the mist there would come a sudden gust of wind across the reeds, the sound of water shifting in the channels, and the strange laughing cry of a piewipe cutting through the darkness. The people believed that was the Tiddy Mun answering them, and by morning, they said, the waters would often have begun to fall. The paths would reappear from beneath the flood. The ground would begin to dry, and the villagers would say quietly amongst themselves that the old Mun had done his work. To the fen folk, this was simply part of living alongside the marsh. The land provided for them, and in return they showed respect to the unseen spirit believed to dwell within it. For as long as the water holes remained deep and the fenlands remained wild, the Tiddy Mun, they believed, would remain content.
So for generations, the fen folk understood this landscape. And when the engineers came from Holland, they were told that it was just wasteland, that it wasn't really being profitably used. And so King Charles I, he had the idea as well. He thought the same. He thought it was just wasteland. So their idea was to turn it into agricultural land, which they, of course, was going to make ka-ching a hell of a lot of money out of. So the people that lived here, they obviously didn't agree with this. Now, one of the reasons that they said it would be better for them, the engineers, to the people, is that it might get rid of what was quite common here known as marsh fever, which was a little bit like malaria. They said that when they drained it, that would all disappear. But the people knew that the marsh fever was bad, but they had a saying, and it was, "Bad's bad, but meddling's worse."
Across the wetlands of eastern England, a great change was beginning to take place. By the early 17th century, powerful landowners and investors had begun to look upon the marshes and the fens not as living landscapes, but as wasted land waiting to be improved. What followed became known as the Great Draining of the Fens. Engineers from the Netherlands, men who had long experience reclaiming land from water, were brought across the sea to oversee the work. Their methods were bold and unfamiliar to the people who lived in the marshlands. Meandering rivers were straightened. Long, ruler-straight channels were dug across the wetlands. Embankments were raised to hold back floodwaters, and sluice gates were built to control the flow of water into the rivers and the sea. Slowly but relentlessly, the marsh began to change. Water that had once spread across the cars in winter floods was forced into these new drains, running away through deep channels instead of lingering across the land. Pools disappeared, reed beds shrank, and the trembling bogland began to harden beneath the workers' boots. Those behind the schemes promised great benefits. They said the fens would become rich farmland, capable of growing crops where only reeds and rushes had stood before. They said the heavy mists of the marsh would lift, and that the damp air blamed for the dreaded marsh fever would disappear along with the water. But the fen folk were far from convinced. To them, the wetlands were not broken land waiting to be fixed. They were a living landscape that had provided their families for generations. And so, when the Dutch engineers arrived to begin their work, the villagers greeted them with cold suspicion. The old stories say the locals offered them neither bedding, nor food, nor friendly words. Instead, in kitchens and in inns, on the great settles where neighbours gathered to talk, people began muttering that troubling days lay ahead for the Carrs. Because as the work went on, the people could see that draining the marsh would change everything around them. The fish and the eels that lived in the dark channels would disappear. The waterfowl that nested in the reeds would lose their feeding grounds. The insects, the birds, the grazing animals, all the small lives that shared the wetlands would be forced away as the water ran out of the bog. But there was something else troubling the villagers too. And as the drains grew deeper and the pools began to vanish, people started asking a question that no one could answer. If the marsh was drained and the water holes were emptied, where would the Tiddy Mun live then? And if the old spirit of the marsh was driven from his home, what sort of anger might follow? Before long, the villagers began shaking their heads and whispering darkly to one another. For sure, ill comes of crossing Tiddy Mun.
So, of course, with all this change and upheaval for both the people and the landscape, misfortune started to creep in. And being the sort of superstitious people that they were at the time, they automatically looked to blame things like witches and fairies. And they did certain things to try and stop it from happening, but nothing worked. So then they realised the worst thing that could have possibly happened had indeed happened.
The old stories say that strange misfortune began creeping slowly through these villages, touching almost every household in one way or another. At first, the people searched for other explanations. In a world where superstition and folklore lived side by side with everyday life, it was easy enough to blame witches, fairies, or other troublesome spirits said to haunt the marsh. But the troubles didn't stop, and if anything, they grew worse. Livestock that had once grazed happily across the marsh pasture began to fail. Animals refused their food and they weakened for no clear reason. Inside the cottages, things seemed just as bad. Food spoiled, walls tumbled down upon themselves, and people began to feel as though something unseen had turned against them. And worse still, sickness began to spread among the people. The old stories speak quietly of the babies. Mothers would hold their bairns close, watching their small pale faces grow weaker with each passing day. Children who had once been lively and bright seemed to fade slowly in their arms, like delicate flowers wilting before their time. Many never recovered at all. For the fen folk, this was the most terrifying sign of all. Livestock might fail, crops might spoil, houses might fall into ruin, but when the children themselves began to sicken and die, people believed something far more serious was at work. The villagers began whispering that perhaps they'd been right all along. Perhaps disturbing the marsh had angered the old spirit who lived within it. One old account says that after the pools were drained and the waterholes destroyed, and Tiddy Mun cast his anger upon the Carr folk with a curse. And the people described the calamities in their own words. The coos pined, the pigs starved, and the ponies went lame. The brats took sick, the lambs dwined, the creed meal burnt itself, and the new milk cradled. The thatch fell in, and the walls burst out, and all Ananders went arsey-varsey. There were darker rumours too. It was said that one of the Dutch workers had disappeared without a trace. Men searched the reed beds and the newly dug drains. No sign of him was ever found. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, nothing at all. The Carr folk believed they knew exactly what had happened. They said the old Mun had taken him, dragged him down into one of the dark mud holes that still lurked beneath the draining marsh. And after that, whenever fresh misfortune struck the villages, the people would shake their heads and whisper of the Mun's curse. Life itself seemed to be turning upside down, or as the old story remembered it, all Ananders went arsey-varsey.
We're now at the point in our story where things really take a turn for the worst. So the animals are starting to go lame, they're stopping eating, the harvests are failing. Worst of all, the people are getting sick and the children and the babies start to die. Now at this point I will say there is some really difficult parts of that's coming up in the next part of the story. So if you feel that that might trigger you in any way, then please do. This is a warning. You might want to turn away now. But yeah, we'll carry on for those that want to stay. So the people are really concerned. So they decide to look at the old ways. They remember the days when they used to call upon the Tiddy Mun to help them with the rise and fall of the waters. And they think that if they can convince him that it's not them doing the damage to his habitat, and that they are on his side, maybe he can be convinced to lift that curse.
When the night of the new moon finally arrived, the car folk gathered together as they had planned. Men and women came quietly across the darkening marsh in small groups, some bringing their children with them. Each person carried a jug of fresh water in their hands as they made their way toward the dike edge. They walked nervously through the twilight. Every sigh of wind through the reeds made them start, and every snapping twig in the darkness made them turn their heads. But there was something strange about the marsh that night. The old boggarts and wandering lights that people once feared in these wetlands were nowhere to be seen. The water had been drained away, and many believed the spirits that once haunted the bog had vanished with it. As the last light faded from the sky, the villagers gathered together beside the dike. They stood close to one another, listening to the uneasy whisper of the wind and the gentle lip-lap of water against the bank. Then at last, together, they called out across the dark marsh, "Tiddy Mun without a name, here's water for thee. Take the spell undone." And as they spoke the words, they poured the water from their jugs into the dike, and they waited. At first there was only silence. A heavy stillness settled across the fen, the kind of quiet that makes the hairs rise on the back of your neck. And then, just as the villagers began to fear that their plea had gone unheard, a terrible sound rose out of the darkness. All around them came the sound of wailing, soft at first, then growing louder. It sounded like the crying of small children drifting through the mist, thin, heartbreaking sobs echoing across the marsh as though the night itself had begun to mourn. The sound pierced the hearts of the villagers, especially the mothers who had already lost their bairns. Some cried out into the darkness, begging the Tiddy Mun to lift the curse and spare the children who remained. Others swore they felt strange things moving around them in the twilight. The brush of tiny hands against their clothing, the faint touch of cold lips against their cheeks, or the flutter of soft wings passing through the air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the crying stopped. The marsh fell silent once again. For a moment the villagers heard nothing but the gentle lapping of water at their feet and the distant bark of a dog from the village. And then from somewhere across the darkened marsh came a sound that every one of them recognised, the sharp, eerie cry of the piewipe. Once, and then again. The car folk knew that call well. It was the sound they believed belonged to the old Mun himself. And that night the cry did not sound angry. It sounded gentle, almost kind. The villagers knew then that their plea had been heard and the spell had been lifted. People laughed and cried together in relief, embracing one another like children released from school. They began to make their way home across the marsh with lighter hearts. And from that day forward, the old tale says that life in the cars began slowly to recover. The cattle grew strong again, the pigs fattened, and food returned to the tables of the villagers. The children who had been sick began at last to grow well. But there were mothers who walked home quietly that night, their arms empty and their hearts heavy as they thought of the bairns they had already lost. From that night onward, whenever the new moon came round, the car folk would walk to the nearest dike edge, fathers, mothers and children together, and they would pour fresh water into the dike and call out once more, Tiddy Mun without a name, here's water for thee.
So at this point, I'm going to bring Tim back into the tale again. My friend Tim, he's really helped me out with this, because a lot of these old local legends, they've only been passed down orally, and that way lots of them get forgotten about. Not the story of the Tiddy Mun though, because there was a lady by the name of MC Balfour, and she lived in the Ancombe Valley for some time. And what she did is she went to speak to people and wrote down some of the legends and the stories that they were telling her. The Tiddy Mun is one of those stories. She then passed, according to Tim, she then passed some of those stories over to a local folklore history club. They wrote them down in a book just like this one. Tim's let me borrow this one from the library. I promise I'm going to look after it for him. But yeah, she wrote it down. They were published in these books, and that's how the story came about. So I think it's absolutely fascinating, because if it wasn't for people like this lady, this story might have been lost forever. And I wonder how many other stories out there that haven't been written down that are indeed now lost.
The story of the Tiddy Mun that we've been following today did not simply appear out of thin, misty marsh air. Mrs. Balfour explained that the tale was told to her by someone with first-hand experience, and after gathering these stories and writing them down, they were eventually published in a small series of folklore books. It is upon those pages that we read how she first came upon the old Mun. I heard the first from an aged woman, a lifelong dweller in these cars, who in her young days herself observed the rite she describes, though she would not confess it to within the hearing of her grandchildren, whose indifference and disbelief shocked her greatly. To her, Tiddy Mun was a perfect reality, and one to be loved as well as feared. She is now dead, and I doubt whether anyone else knows the legend, which she said had been forgotten for many years by all but herself and one or two old friends, all gone before her. I tell it as it was told to me. That detail alone makes the story all the more intriguing, because according to the woman who told it, the strange gathering at the dyke edge, the night when the carfolk poured water into the marsh and called upon the Tiddy Mun to lift the curse, was not simply an old legend from centuries past. She claimed that in her younger days she had actually seen the ritual take place. Now, whether that was literal memory, inherited family tradition, or simply the powerful way folklore embeds itself into people's lives, it's impossible to know. But it tells us something important about the world these people lived in. Even by the late 19th century, there were still individuals in the Ancombe Valley who spoke of the unseen spirits of the marshlands with a quiet certainty, as though the boundary between the natural world and the supernatural had once been far thinner than it is today. Now, since Mrs. Balfour first recorded the story, the tale of the Tiddy Mun has appeared in other folklore collections and retellings. Some later writers have even expanded the legend further. One author, Adrian Gray, describes not just the Tiddy Mun himself, but an entire race of marshland creatures known as the Tiddy People, with the Tiddy Mun acting as their leader. Whether those additions reflect older traditions that were never written down, or simply the way folklore grows and changes as it passes from one storyteller to the next, is difficult to say. But what remains clear is that for the people who once lived in landscapes like these, the marshes were never simply empty wetlands. They were places filled with mystery, places where the wind in the reeds, the drifting mist, and the cry of a piewipe might make someone wonder if something unseen was moving quietly through the twilight.
Today in our modern world, we can put our own rational thoughts on why some of the things were happening to these people and to their landscape after the drainage. One of the things I thought was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure you will too, is this idea of marsh fever, because marsh fever in effect was very much like malaria. It travelled from insects to people. But one of the things that the people in this area did to combat marsh fever, they used to take gin with opium. Now, of course, we now know that what that can do. And the interesting thing is they took that concoction to get themselves feeling better from the marsh fever, and they did. They felt great after that. But as soon as they stopped taking it, they started to get shakes again. They started to get hallucinations, and once again they thought they had the marsh fever again. But of course we now know it's sort of a withdrawal from taking what was practically heroin, isn't it? So there's lots of things like that. I thought that was an interesting one, but there's other things to explain some of the things that were going on here.
When modern researchers have looked back at the stories like this, some have suggested that the misfortunes described by the car folk may not have been a supernatural curse at all, but the natural consequence of suddenly changing a fragile wetland landscape. Draining marshland doesn't just remove water, it alters an entire ecosystem. Animals that had spent generations grazing on soft, wet ground suddenly find themselves walking across dry, hard soil, and that alone could lead to sore feet, lameness, and changes in feeding behaviour. The plants that once grew in the wetlands would also begin to disappear, replaced by new vegetation as the land dried. For livestock used to a particular diet, even small changes can cause them to refuse food and grow weak. But then there was a question of disease. So marsh fever, which we now know was a form of malaria, was carried by mosquitoes that thrived in damp environments. Ironically, disturbing the wetlands may initially have made things worse. Destroying the reed beds and habitats that supported other insects could have upset the natural balance and allowed disease-carrying insects to spread more easily. For the people living here, the suffering would have felt very real. The animals were failing, their homes were shifting as the drying earth shrank beneath them, and their children were falling sick and dying. To modern researchers, these things may have practical explanations, but to the car folk watching it unfold, it must have felt very much like a curse.
So, I like to ponder on things, and it makes me think about, where does this bring us today? Now, in them days, the engineers, they obviously thought that this was for the best. They obviously saw a lot of ka-ching going on. The people, they just saw their landscape getting destroyed. They saw a landscape that they didn't just have to themselves, but they shared with wildlife, with these mysterious spirits. It was quite difficult for them, as imagine, to adapt to these changes. Now, it gives me that old age question, because there's stories like this all over Britain, because as landscapes change, people have to adapt. There's lots of old stories, lots of old folklore stories. And if you've got any, feel free to share them in the comments. But it gives me, I'm waffling a bit, but it gives me that thinking of, did these spirits actually disappear completely, or did we just stop listening to them?
Perhaps the old stories were never really about tiny spirits hiding in the reeds at all. Perhaps they were simply the way people once tried to make sense of the delicate balance of the natural world around them. Long before ecology became a science, communities who lived close to the land understood something instinctively, that if you disturb a place too greatly, something within it will suffer. The marshes, forests, and rivers that shape our planet are not empty spaces waiting to be improved. They are living environments shaped by wildlife, insects, birds, and people alike. And when those environments change, the effects ripple outward in ways the people before us could not fully understand. The wetlands that once stretched across places like this have largely disappeared now, turned into fields, roads, and towns. And with them, many of the old stories faded too. So perhaps those tales were never really nonsense. Perhaps they were simply reminders that the land is not something we stand above, but something we live within. And that, when we forget that, the balance of things can very quickly turn arsey-varsey.
So that is the old tale of the Tiddy Mun. Thank you to everybody for watching with me. Thank you, of course, massive thank you to Tim for helping me put this together. Tim, I owe you a few beers, I know that. And what I find interesting about folklore stories is they can adapt and change depending on where you are in the country. Now, of course, this is originally, I believe, a North, from what we can gather, obviously what I told about earlier, this is a North Lincolnshire story. But I have heard whispers of stories about the Tiddy Mun in other places as well. So if you know of any stories that sound a little bit similar to this, can you let me know in the comments, please? Because I find it really, really interesting how far these stories travel, especially if it's not in the UK, especially if it's gone a little bit further field as well. So until next week, stay safe, stay curious, and if you find yourself wandering the marsh at twilight as the mist hovers over the black moonlit water, maybe listen out for the sound of the pie wipe screech.